This is not a podcast for comfort. It's a podcast for clarity. In a culture flooded with noise, dangerous narratives, and emotional uncertainty, this space exists to examine what actually matters and what actually works. Here we question power itself, belief systems, and the assumptions most people inherit without inspection. Most people accept instead of dissect. This podcast is about correcting that. Welcome. Bienvenue. Welcome. Marhaban. Bienvenidos to the Magnificent Ones podcast. There's a phase no one prepares you for. Not the crisis, not the pressure, not the moment everything falls apart. But what happens after? After the adrenaline fades, after the urgency disappears, after you're expected to return to normal. Because when decision-making gets dangerous, clarity should return. But often it doesn't. Identity becomes unstable, judgment becomes distorted, and people who perform well under pressure begin miscalculating quietly. Not dramatic failure, just slower thinking, more hesitation, subtle compromises, and over time, that's what changes everything. Welcome back to the Magnificent Ones. Today's conversation is about what happens when survival mode ends. My guest today is Savio P. Clemente. He's a 2-time cancer survivor, TEDx speaker, healthcare leadership strategist, and a journalist who has interviewed more than 2,000 leaders. His work focuses on decision-making under pressure, but more importantly, what happens after the pressure ends. Because many people don't collapse during crisis, they collapse after. Savio, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much. I'm doing well. I appreciate the opportunity to be on this platform with you and to speak about something so searing like overcoming.
Oh, wonderful. So since the introductions are already out of the way, I figured I'd start with my personal favorite question, which we talked about in the pre-interview. You said that leaders often perform best during crisis, but struggle once it ends. Why do you think clarity disappears after pressure is gone?
I think for the most part, leaders especially have to not only perform, but have to model and have to put on an armor. And I think when that pressure exceeds what is natural for them, then it becomes so troubling and so overwhelming that they have to seek refuge. And the only way they could do that is to pretend their way through it. But as someone like myself with a background and lived experience that I've had, that's not really how crisis and the after post-crisis works. It works because you have to face the discomfort and accept it and find strategies and tools in order to overcome them. And that's the hard part because you're not only leading yourself, you're leading a team, you're leading the organization. And that amount of responsibility can be overwhelming.
So what's something that's changed after survival mode is gone? What's one of the biggest changes that come out of that?
I think a level of authenticity and also a level of presence. Those words are used interchangeably, and they're also used finitely, right? A lot of people use that word or those words in order to express what they think is the most cliche thing. But really what that really means is that are you able to be very, very transparent with yourself and your actions and your motives and your directives with your team? In order to lead, you have to lead yourself. So your team and the organization models and mirrors what you put out, what you give out. And so oftentimes, especially in the areas of leadership, healthcare leadership that I study, it's when the performance has to still continue. How do you reconcile that? How do you negotiate that? And how do you accept that? And those are the hard parts that not only leaders, but people in general are not willing to face.
I think, it's very telling when a person who, say you've known them for maybe 20 years and you've known them as the strong one, the reliable one, and, a crisis occurs, whatever the crisis is, maybe a loss, in their personal life, or maybe they're going through some health crisis of sorts, and they've had this identity for, say, 20 years, 30 years, well, however long. And now they have to balance whether they pretend to still be that person that they've been all along, or they struggle with showing people who they are right now. What's your experience in that realm?
I I would say to the large part that you have to have some level of professionalism. You have to have some level of boundary. So I'm not saying those
Mhm,
need to bleed, but you do
mhm,
have to some degree, have a commonality with your team and the organization. Otherwise, what ends up happening is you become two individuals. You become the professional everyone leads on to, and then you become someone that people don't really trust all that well because they don't know the human outside of the role. And so I think your body in general sends stress signals, sends
mhm,
patterns. I know for me, if I didn't listen to those, the outcome would have been tragic. I was, as you know, diagnosed in 2014 with non Hodgkin's lymphoma, stage 3. I was in remission for a decade. And then just a routine visit to my ENT about a decade later, he actually said, you're a lymphoma survivor, right? And I'm like, yeah. He goes, do you know B cells can live in the nasal cavity? I'm like, what? I thought I was just going there just for nasal medication. And so then began 16 months of treatment, including a 29-day stay in the hospital, 26 pounds that I lost in the hospital, a visit to the ICU to get norepinephrine, 5 months of an immunotherapy, 4 months of physical therapy, and then I also did a whole bunch of integrated modalities. And I'm reiterating this because I want people to understand that if there is something, especially medical, that's a huge boulder or mountain that just seems insurmountable to climb or to go through, I think the first step you have to do is assess within yourself what are the tools, what is the knowledge, what is the strategies, what is the wisdom, what is the insights that I can cultivate now in this moment. So the first thing to do is to really acknowledge that and to say to yourself, this is where I'm at. And so when I deal with and speak with healthcare leaders, especially who deal with high stakes, I mean, they have responsibilities not only for their team and the organization, but they have responsibility for the other person, the patient that they're looking at. It's life or death for some of them. And so that pressure mounts because at the end of the day, it's a silent pressure because they have to be consistently aware and awake and also approachable and have that care and that understanding. I was fortunate that I had that, but so many people don't.
yes. I will speak briefly on this. When it came to the whole concept of, say, survival mode, and I find that in a lot of high performing individuals, that it's almost as if we need a crisis to solve sometimes, and we don't see that's to our detriment, and that becomes tied to our identity because we're the fixers and the reliable ones, and so as long as everyone's coming to us and like we have a sense of purpose, because maybe you don't have that in your personal life, but in your professional life you get to be the hero. And I almost feel as though we create a system in which it's a negative system, but we have a sense of purpose because there's a problem, and it could overextend us. It could put us in situation where we're not necessarily focusing on our bodies, our mental health, our health in general, and we just keep going. And as long as we keep going, we feel like, hey, we're doing good work, we're not letting people down, but we're not seeing that we're not taking care of the body, right? Or the soul, or however you want to phrase it. We're not taking care of us. And by not taking care of caring of us, we miss things. And the addiction, I do in some ways feel that it is addiction, that we get so caught up in being the one that everyone comes to that we neglect ourselves in the process. And we don't see how far we've gone off the course and how deeply imbalanced our health and to our profession ratio is. Was that ever your case? Where did you ever focus way too much on work and not enough on yourself at any time?
Well, initially, when I had the first cancer bout, I was still working. But after the relapse a decade later, there's no way I could have, because I knew for myself, Oakley, that I had to give 100% of my attention, my energy, my focus, my emotion, my mental acuity. I had to give everything to it because of what was involved in the treatment protocol. It wasn't as simple as the first time around. The first time around, it was just 6 rounds of a chemotherapy called R-CHOP. This time it was 2-3-day hospital stays, getting chemo, then injecting myself in order to stimulate stem cells, going into an actual office setting and getting my stem cell harvested, getting a neck catheter, then being placed in a hospital. Typically, it's 3 weeks in a quarantine room. I was there for 4 weeks. One night, because of the whole treatment, I had to go to the ICU. My pulse would rise every time I would stand up to 160, 170, and they had to give me norepinephrine. Like I mentioned, I lost 26 pounds. And in that whole process of the hospital stay, I think what I found as anchors, and it wasn't even intentional, it's something that I just found in general. I was put in a quarantine room, and because I was in that room, and even though every 4 hours they would check my vitals, the nurse would come in and give me my medication, I had 2 things that were accessible to me no matter what the situation was, no matter what time it was silence and stillness. And those 2 things have been echoed in so many belief systems throughout time.
Mm-hmm.
But when you really sink into it and surrender into that silence and stillness, you find a power, you find an awakening. You also find that you touch something so deep and guttural, because who are you? Who was I in that hospital bed tied to all those machines? Yes, the physical part of me was suffering. Yes, I was in massive discomfort. Yes, I was dealing with some side effects, but my spirit was still alive. I still had mental faculty still running. My emotions were open. So I had to really understand that maybe the process of this suffering, which I call a spiritual exile. So some context, I grew up Catholic and I went to elementary school, Catholic elementary school. I was an altar boy. But in college, I decided to study various belief systems. So I've studied everything from Buddhism up until Vedic philosophy. And for me, I find that there's truths in all those if you just really germinate or really ferret out what is actually being said. That part is the responsibility of the person trying to understand. And so I speak to this because I want people to understand that you're much greater than your circumstance. You're much greater than the situation that's happening to you. And even though you are in that pain at the moment, because no one wants to be in a hospital, you can allow yourself to have a vision. As a board certified wellness coach, we talk about this idea of vision. Vision is not a goal. Vision is how you want to feel, how you want to be, how do you want to reclaim what was stolen or taken away from you. And that's a very large endeavor. And so the silence and the stillness helped me to not only come terms with it, not only to accept it, but to surrender to the situation at hand.
Do I'm not often at a loss for words. I think when you can see so many people who they can be intelligent, but it doesn't mean they know when to stop and reassess their life. It happens, maybe they're 75 and they're alone then, right? It's like their friends have passed or their significant other has passed. And it's like now they're still because, well, they're silenced by nature. not, hey, I've taken the time to consciously consider where I am in life and where I'm headed, right? And to have the ability to, like you said, you had two things when you were in the hospital. You had silence and you had stillness. And to take the time to question, and questioning is the starting point of every scientific thinking, right? So by asking yourself a question, you can then focus on a roadmap to where you want to go. What were some of the things that came to you in your stillness?
Yeah, it was really this idea of self-regulation. Like, what can I control? Oakley, can I control my hemoglobin levels? No. Can I control my white blood cells? No. Can I control my red blood cells? No. I can't control those things. And I have to defer to experts like doctors who actually can measure those things, can analyze those things and tell me if they work. Now, did I use AI when I was in? Yeah, I did actually. What happened is that every time they would take my blood every 4 hours, and let's say something came up high, I would copy and paste that into my AI. And I would say, is this a discussion for when the doctors make their rounds? And I would be bold and ask, I mean, at one point, one day, there were like 13 doctors deep. I mean, doctors and nurses deep. I wasn't afraid. You know why? Because people often defer their power over to what I call the Wizard of Oz, the actual Oz.
Hmm.
And that's not what healing is. Healing is not linear. It's not, it's unstructured. It's
Yes.
highs and lows. It's underneath, it's over. And I knew I had to be in partnership with that team. And fortunately, I had a good team that they listened to me. They didn't dismiss me. They allowed me to freely speak. I even said to them one night, because I would survey the nurses that would come. I asked probably about 7 or 8 nurses throughout the whole 29 days. And I said, they're like, oh no, this stem cell is like serious. They're like, you're in a quarantine room for a reason because we want to stave off any infections. But they're like, there's so many patients, Savio, that want to rush home. And then they rush home and they have an infection, they have to come back. And they have to, I heard this throughout different nurses. I would just ask randomly. And so I told the doctors who made the rounds, I was like, listen, I'm not one of your patients who wants to rush to get home. Don't get me wrong. I would love to go home, but I'm not one. I don't want to come back. So whatever you need to do to discharge me, if it's ready and it's time, then discharge me. Otherwise, I'm good. You're not going to hear a complaint, with me. And I'm not trying to create a picture for those listening to this podcast because I dealt with diarrhea issues. I mean, I'm talking about every couple of hours.
Hmm.
Thankfully, I didn't vomit. I did have some dental issues as well. I felt extremely lethargic. There was one whole week that I had no desire to eat food. Like the thought of eating something was just like repulsive to me. One day, I think I only ate black olives, black on my salad, black olives. And I even had to ask my sister to come and bring me Pepsi, which I don't drink really soda. I used to drink it when I was younger. I just don't drink it. And she's like, Pepsi? I'm like, yeah. I'm like, because they're giving me these fat pills. And I'm like, I just couldn't drink water anymore. It was just, I couldn't drink juice anymore. I needed something bubbly and like Pepsi. I needed something like that. So she got it for me, thankfully. And so I
Hmm.
don't want to paint the picture that it was hunky dory, that I was like in this quasi spiritual state and nothing affected. No, it was guttural. Okay. It was nasty. Okay. It was bad. But I also knew that if I did not give my full attention to it, did not give my full presence to it, did not give my full and full spark of my whatever you want to call it, light or energy or soul, if I didn't give that to this, then I don't know if I would be speaking to you today.
Man, if could you tell, I guess, me, right? How many in coaching, how many people do you have a similar conversation to? Maybe not to that extent, to get them to understand what's at stake for themselves if they don't reassess and reevaluate where they are right now. Because I'm sure with your lived, experience and from your perspective, you can see certain telling signs that this person, as a founder, CEO, what have you, or manager, they're a step away from not being in a good state. What are some situations that you encounter?
Sure. So initially, when I started coaching years and years ago, I was coaching regular individuals, and then I moved on to coaching cancer survivors. And
Mhm.
oftentimes they would talk about this idea of betrayal. Why did my body betray me? Right? Now I've obviously moved on to executive coaching. I coach healthcare leaders, and the talk is about the pressure. The talk is about the burnout, but specifically about certain terminologies that maybe to your audience doesn't mean anything. But we talk about things like preventing costly reversals, right? This idea of things that were widely adopted, but they realize it's not better than the standard of care. This idea of post-crisis, after the crisis has happened, how do you reorientate? So, for example, COVID-19 was great as an example. Innovation happened, the things were adopted, but did they really work out? There were holes in a lot of it. Then obviously we talk about this idea of like return on investment, right? The pressure is not only the patient side, it's also about the administration side,
Mhm.
the bureaucratic side. And then we talk about this idea of converting that from like that disruption into discernment, having a more clarity and composure with that. So those are all logistical things. But at the end of the
Mhm.
day, I will tell you, no matter if I'm coaching an executive or I'm coaching just a regular person, the human truths are all the same. It's
Yes.
how do I live in a world where people are constantly pulling at me when I myself am doubting myself, when I myself have a role to perform. And at the end of the day, how am I bringing joy and spark to the world and to myself? How am I bringing my success into a world full of disruption? I mean, there's so much disruption now that I don't even know how people are dealing with it. There's political disruption, there's social
Mhm.
disruption, there's technological disruption. People are getting fired left and right with AI. There's the advent of people having to upskill themselves to learn a new technology like AI. I mean, if you thought the dot com boom, and I lived through the dot com boom, I graduated in the dot com boom, and I also was a casualty of the dot com crash. Not that AI is going to crash, but I was. So the key elements here are how do I bounce back? So we talk about resilience, right? But I like to challenge that word. And I say, let's talk about what was not only my professional understanding and my training, but this idea of my
Mhm.
lived experience. I'm talking about adaptive resilience. That when you're in the SHIT, when you're in that discomfort, that pain, like I was, how do you remain flexible? How do you make connections? How do you strategize and figure out for yourself, well, what can I do in this moment? What do I have control over? What do I not have control over? What can I pronounce today? What can I allow myself to discover about myself through this particular problem?
Something that I find amazing is that people who, and this is me overgeneralizing here, who have the ability to ask questions, say pre-crisis, and they ask questions during crisis, and they ask questions after crisis. So they're always reevaluating. And so that maybe that's a component of your identity is that you're always reassessing, right? And not many people take the time to just maybe look in the mirror over, this is a cliche. Today I feel like I'm a 5. Tomorrow I feel like a 10. But we don't take the time to just pause and just see where we are. And so we just keep performing, right? And even our job becomes a performance. I'm not talking about getting the job done. I'm saying that we're like the actors, right? The unpaid actors that's showing up and everything's fine and we're smiling and we're shaking the hands and we're still not taking the time to do the check-ins. How helpful do you think it would be if we just took the time to just do some check-ins with ourselves?
I'm going to echo what Michael Jackson, the great Michael Jackson said. I'm starting with the man in the mirror, asking him to make the change. I'm not going to make your listeners listen to that any longer, but that is a human truth. And he tapped into something so beautiful. Because at the end of the day, and I echo this in my TEDx talk. So I did a TEDx talk about a year and a half before my relapse in June of 2024. It was entitled 7 Minutes to Wellness, How to Love Your Inner Stranger. And people say to me, they're like, that's so ambiguous. What's this inner stranger? And I said, well, what's the inner stranger to you? I said, I left it ambiguous on purpose. They're like, okay, so what is it to you, Savio? And I'm like, okay, well, the inner stranger to me, if I really think deeply, is that young person who, for me, never felt grounded. I always felt, even so much so that a friend in high school used to call me nomad. He used to say that I was like a Bedouin nomad. It wasn't the most positive. It wasn't really said like to taunt me. He just said it. And of course I was young, right? I didn't know much. And so I never felt really rooted. I never felt really grounded. That has thankfully changed as I've gotten older. And then when I said that to the person, the female was like, oh, actually, I think my inner stranger is that professional woman that I want to aspire to be, but I just can't reach, or that great mother that I want to emulate, but I just can't do it. Or that sibling that wants to be there, but I just can't be that sibling. That's my inner stranger. And so I mentioned the TEDx talk in relation to this question you just asked, because I have a simple framework. So it's a framework within a framework. My official framework is called the Adaptive Resilience Framework, Leadership Framework. But in it, I talk about something called aloha. So Oakley, as you know, aloha in Hawaiian means hello. So it's a hello to your inner self. And that's really the crux of why I'm even mentioning this question. And I made it very simple for people. So it's an acronym. So A stands for acknowledge. So acknowledge where you are. Don't pretend. So if that means that you need to do a word vomit, a paper vomit, a digital vomit, just vomit everything out that's happening, that you're feeling, that you're sensing, that's a mental consternation for you. Just do that. L stands for listening. So listen to your inner self. So in Hawaiian healing modalities, there's something called huna healing. And in huna healing, they believe that the body gives energy, sensations, knowledge, wisdom. You just have to ask questions to it. And I don't expect you to talk to your body, because that's a little strange in front of other people. But in the privacy of your own home, you could do that. And what I call the three brains, which is the head, heart, and gut, they do give off some information. So you need to just be quiet and still enough in order to listen and try to see what that may tell you. O stands for opening. So open yourself up to the information. So no matter what your belief system, even if you don't have a belief system, just open up to that information, that insight, because it can help guide you to where you need to go. H stands for harnessing. So harness that information. Don't be afraid to make the connections. Don't be afraid to even cross out things that may or may not make sense, but just allow yourself to harness that. And then A is the most important. It's acting. But I have a caveat, and it's acting with courage. You have to have the courage in order to act. So don't be afraid to be that new version of yourself, because I think the number one thing, and a lot of spiritual books will tell you this, is at the end of the day, if you change yourself, people have to change around you. That's just the way it works. Because even the great Einstein says you cannot fix a problem with the same consciousness that created it. So in order to recreate an environmental shift, whether that's in healthcare leadership or that's work or whatever situation that you're in, you need to change yourself. So in other words, it's like the adage of, if you have a cup of water, if it's full, you can't pour any water into it. It's going to spill over. So you have to pour out the contents in order to fill new waters in. And the new waters are people, situations, something that lights you up more so than the work problem that you have.
Two things came to mind as you were speaking, and it was Gandhi, be the change that you wish to see in the world. That speaks to me deeply. And you, the person, at your core, there has to be a relationship with yourself, because we take time to know other people. We take time to learn scientific equations. We take time to learn about AI, take time to learn law, medicine, all these things, when we should also take time to know ourselves. Like what makes, Savio tick? What makes Savio happy? Like, why is it that the main driver of what makes us successful is us and our actions, yet we don't take time to actually invest in ourselves until it's too late? It's like, I'm 85 years old now when I take the time to invest in myself. when we can invest in ourselves now, get to know ourselves now, right? And the more we take time to know ourselves, the better off we'll be in the long run, short run, because as you said, you can then create healthy boundaries because you know what your line in the sand is, right? You know what your boundaries are and you know what you're willing to compromise and not. So why do you think in society as a whole, that's not an emphasis to really focus on ourselves? It's just, hey, keep going, you know? Why do we just keep
I
going, you know?
think it's a few things. The research and the validated studies will tell you that it's not only based upon performance, but it's based upon how others perceive you. And so you have
Mhm,
to then feel that have to capture people's attention. You have to one up this idea of the Joneses. And then also to a
mhm,
large degree, it's if you don't create, then who are you? If your identity is not tied to a role or something situational, then you're considered a bum. You're considered someone who doesn't have any aspirations. And there's a sense of lawlessness there, which I think what ends up happening is people then judge themselves and then unfortunately they get involved in things that are detrimental to not only their livelihood but to their safety. And so I think what's really important is echoing back to what I mentioned earlier about this idea of self-regulation and also even my trainings, this idea of intentionality. And the only way to do that is to really find and carve out days and opportunities for yourself where you can cultivate that. So the weekend doesn't have to just be about shopping and food prep and and lounging around. It could just be spending a few moments in whether that's meditation or prayer or light walking, brisk walking or journaling or breathing exercise. You do a simple box breathing, 4 in, 4 out, hold, and then, repeat again. There's something that I like to use in my coaching and also in my keynote speaking is that this idea of psychological distancing. So before I get in trouble with any
mhm.
psychologists and psychiatrists, when I mean psychological distancing, I don't mean detachment or disassociation. I mean having that distance between you and the problem. And by doing that, you allow
Mhm.
breath, the actual breath, to form because Eastern philosophy will tell you they always look to nature, Oakley. They always say the seed germinates when it germinates. It doesn't rush. Just like the river doesn't rush, it knows its direction. So if there's stones or rocks or boulders in front of it, it goes under, it goes over, but it's patient. It knows the flow of how that happens. And then what ends up happening is people want the current of the river to go faster. And I'll cop to this. I've wanted it because if you look at my credentials, you look at my resume, and you look at what I've produced beyond the cancer bouts that I've had, they would say, "Oh, wow, you must be like a type A personality." And maybe to some degree, I would be in their consideration for that. But for me, it's never really been about trying to keep up and okay, maybe in my younger days, that was probably the case. But life has shown me that meaning is derived from what actually gives me joy and pleasure and how I extend that graciousness, that devotion to work to other people. And so I think it's very important that we just assess and take a daily inventory or a weekly inventory or a monthly inventory as to not only what lights us up, but what are the subtle changes we need to make in order. I'll give you an analogy. So when you play an instrument, it's not tuned in correctly. What ends up happening to the actual expert ear, it's not played properly. And so I think it behooves us to try to understand what kind of notes we're putting out into the world and how we want it to be received. And most importantly, how we perceive what work we put out, how it sounds to us, how it reflects back to us.
How are you able to discern your coaching, your lived experience? How are you able to discern when someone is in a state of crisis or maybe, they've gone through prolonged, pressure? How are you able to even help people identify that? Like, maybe just give an example or a story of that?
Sure. So the number one thing we were always told is this idea that intelligence was like the number one quality to have. Then we were told, no, no, no.
Mhm.
Emotional intelligence is because the emotions make choices and they actually make decisions. Okay. But actually, the research points to this idea of metacognition. So it's the thinking beyond the thinking. And so when I'm in front
Mhm.
of an audience noting, or I'm coaching an executive, or I'm even interviewing someone as a journalist, the one thing that I always notice, and I think Oprah actually has said this herself, is that when that interview or that speaking or that coaching session has ended, they always want feedback on how they did. And so I tie into this idea of metacognition because if you're thinking about the thinking and you're the person who's actually speaking or you're the person who's actually being coached, is your problem something that's actually present or are they just remnants of things from the past? So if you're living from the past, then you're not actually living. You're just existing. You're just you're just responding to things. So are you actually responding? Are you receiving? What are you doing? So that's the number one thing I know I look for. But I
Mhm.
also want to clarify to those listeners, coaching is not mentoring. Coaching is not being a consultant either. Coaching is allowing the person in front of you to come up with the answers themselves because once they do, it sticks and they actually learn and generate. Because one thing that I learned initially when I started my whole coaching certifications, and I have two of them from the ICF and also board certified from the National Board Certification, is this idea of the trans theoretical model of change. It's called the stages of change. And what it
Mhm.
posits is that it's not that people don't want to change. It's that they don't know how to change. They don't have the tools necessary to know how to change. So in other words, are they pre-contemplating it? Oh, okay, maybe I'll do it. Are they actually contemplating? Yeah, I'm going to do it. Are they in action of it? Oh, okay. Are they willing to continue that and prolong that? Are they thinking about not doing it? So that's a relapse. Right? So as a coach, especially an executive coach like myself, we actually guide the individual in that way to not only reframe problems. I'll give you a classic example. When I was in the hospital, I would have people tell me, my people, now remember, this is a relapse. So, and I also, as a journalist and also a best-selling author, I've interviewed cancer survivors. I interviewed 200 of them. I took 35 of their stories, told my own, wrote a book called I Survived Cancer. Here's how I did it. 35 cancer survivors share their journey. Thankfully, it became a bestseller in like 4 categories. And to me, it wasn't the fact that it was just a bestseller, it was that it actually landed with people, that people actually got some information from it because it was a compilation of the interviews. And at the end, I asked the people who contributed, I said, I want you to put your website, I want you to put your social media. They're like, what? I'm like, yeah, I want you to promote yourself. They're like, that's odd. I'm like, no, because I want people reading it to know that you're alive, that you're living, that you're thriving, that you're doing, that cancer doesn't have to be the end of the story. Doesn't have to be the end of your sentence. It could be more than that. And so I say this all really for people to understand that the power does lie within us. And there's horrible things that happen. Don't get me wrong. Since my relapse in June of 2024, I've known 8 people who died of cancer. And
Mhm.
some of them, it was just their first bout with it. So I don't take my work and what I do and what I'm saying very lightly. I take great responsibility because I look at it as a daily devotional to the work, to myself, and to others. So it's beyond gratitude because gratitude to some degree feels like it's rote. Like if you write and you write down, okay, I'm grateful for grateful that one of my one of the individuals that I trained with, he's a University of Pennsylvania professor, says that the larger question to ask about gratitude is why. So, for example, I am grateful for the house I live in. Okay. Why are you grateful for it? How did that actually happen? What did it happen because you worked really hard? You saved, you made some right investments, you finally decided that you deserved it. The why allows that stickiness to actually flourish. And that's the key.
So as you talk about the why, there has to be some slowing down to even begin to ask the why. So do you ever encourage some leaders to just slow down and process, evaluate? What does that look like with your line of work?
Well, in the job, it's really hard for leaders because they have to make quick decisions, especially healthcare leaders. But what I
Mhm,
ask them to do is to carve out that time that they think is suitable for them to do that. One of my favorite shows on TV is called The Pit. It's on HBO Max. I don't know if you watched it, but it stars Noah Wyle. And I'll tell you truthfully, Oakley, when I'm watching that show, my nervous system is a wreck, my friend. I mean, even though
mhm,
I'm someone who's meditated for now over 20 years, I'm a wreck watching the show, but I love it. I love it. But they make some high stakes decisions. I mean, they really do. And they put not only their life on the line, because sometimes these patients are extremely aggressive, but
mhm,
I think the show is slowly showing you that these healthcare leaders are in trouble and they need to take out that time. So whether that's, like I mentioned, you go to the basics. It doesn't have to be so complex. It doesn't have to be that it has to be a spa day. If it is a spa day, wonderful, but it doesn't have to be. It could just be a couple of breaths. It could be a couple of notes to yourself. It could be writing in a journal. It could be allowing yourself to look at the bigger picture, having that psychological distance that I mentioned, having that adaptive resilience that when you're in the problem, you're able to have a more expansive viewpoint. And that's very, very key. So thank you for asking that question.
So I guess my follow-up would be, have you ever encountered an individual that is definitely in survival mode, but doesn't realize they're in survival mode? But all that their situation and their environment is like, hey, you're in survival mode, and then having them come to the realization that you're right now you're in survival mode, and how do you help them navigate that once you've identified it? Sometimes we don't know there's a problem because it doesn't have a name. And maybe it's not a name that you've ever associated yourself with. And so you're like, that problem doesn't exist because I'm a go-getter. I'm a force to be reckoned with. Have you encountered that at all?
Yeah. Well, there's a difference between survival mode and this idea of integration, right?
Mhm,
Survival mode is getting through the crisis. But my lane and what I speak on and what I coach on and what I write about is this idea of after the crisis, how do you get back to your old self? That old operating system no longer works. So how do you
mhm,
reset? How do you gain the clarity, the composure to do that? And so yes, are they in denial? Of course they are. But at the end of the day, I can't take them out of that survival mode. Survival mode is only realized and fully overcome when they feel safe enough that they can continue. That's not something that I can externally do for them. What we can do is
mhm,
do the talk therapy. I use tools like embodiment practices, somatic practices where the body, like I said, talks to you or gives you sensation. We can delve deeply into that. We can talk about the felt experience, naming something that you can't really actually name, but you can actually name how and why it actually exists, whether that's a visual, a sound, or a movement of some kind. We can actually do things like actually go back into the past, although you have to be very careful because that delves into the realm of therapy and coaching is
mhm.
not therapeutic in that sense. But we can
Absolutely.
also inform where that starting point first started, right? I'll give you a classic example. There was an executive that I coached, and in the coaching session, because my coaching sessions are meant to elicit whatever is there. So there's literally nothing that we block off. You can go anywhere. And when he was talking, I just randomly mentioned, I'm like, because he mentioned that he was like a latchkey kid. And I just asked him, I said, what was your favorite commercials? And he was like, huh? Like, yeah, what was your favorite commercials? And he's like, he's talking and he tells me there was like two of them. And he's like, that's a strange question to ask me. Like he literally broke the fourth wall, so to speak. And I'm like, oh, I just asked. And then he realized, I didn't. He realized in that moment, that's why he became an ad executive. That's why he became an ad executive, is because in a marketing executive is because of that reason. And he didn't even put two and two together. And the thing is, he was at that point in his life where he wanted to not be that anymore. So what I'm just getting at is that this is not forced information. This is information that's continually moving, and it's about assessing, reassessing, and then reassessing again until you come to that crux where change tips over. It's actually the actual tipping point.
If someone's realizing that they're over the crisis and survival mode has, dissipated, and they're having trouble with clarity because now they have to figure out who they are, because you brought up that old version of themselves it's no longer there. There's a new integrated operating system. So how do they, or what steps do they take to get clarity, or how do you find who you are now? Because there was a version before you. So how do you establish clarity?
Yeah. So whether that's my keynoting or that's my coaching or even in my interviews, the first thing you have to establish is if we're coaching, what is the goal of the coaching? Because coaching is a conversation with a purpose. Otherwise, it's just a conversation. So that's not really what coaching is. Coaching is we have to get to some type of endpoint or some type of destination, not complete destination, but a destination of some kind. And so the high performers that I work with, is that they just don't survive the disruption. They don't just survive the adversity. They convert it into that strategic advantage. So it's really the ability to allow them to discover what the problem is, because that's where it all starts from, or what the pain point is. And then where would they like to go with this? And sometimes, especially in a coaching session, we don't know how it's going to end. They may say, I want that result, but it might be something completely different, or we go off tangents. I mean, that's just life. That's just how us humans are built. But the key element in all that is for you to have the ability or have the desire to want to work this out. Because so many times people just don't want to do the work. And if you don't do the work with anything in life to a degree, I'm not saying that it needs to always be so hard, because that is telling as well. But the work in and of itself allows you to figure out what's important, what do I want to keep, what do I want to let go of, and what is it that for me in my work, in my line, that I want to actually manifest. And I often tell people the best way to create that is to do a mental map or a physical map and just plot out the points, whether that is per quarter, monthly, and do an easy thing like reverse engineer. Find out for yourself what you feel the goal is and backtrack. Figure out what are the reverse steps that you need to where you are. And if you're just starting from the beginning, yes, that's going to require a lot of effort. But if you're in the midpoint, then if you look at the physical map or you look at something that you plotted in real time, you're like, oh, I'm actually not as far as I think I am. But in your mind, because there's so much consternation and so much bubbling of information and stress and responsibility, we often don't see that sometimes we're closer than we think.
And here's the question. This is a personal question that I was so fascinated by. And as I was looking through your work, I was like, man, Savio could have been 10 million different things, and you have a very extensive, portfolio. Out of all the industries that you could have worked in, or, you've obviously worked in a lot regardless, but as far as coaching is concerned, why did you choose healthcare? How did that come to be?
So my actual board certification is called NBC-HWC, National Board Health and Wellness Coach. And so for me, and then I also have an ICF certification. ICF just means International Coaching Federation, is considered the gold standard in coaching. I wanted to make sure that if I was to be a coach, because I could have, like you said, gone into different areas, think what appealed to me was the fact that I'm guiding someone on their own discovery. I'm not telling someone stuff. Yes, sometimes you can interject and say, well, what about this and what about that? I'm not saying that's off limits. That is permitted, so to speak. But coaching really inspired me because I feel like a part of what I discovered, a part of my own transformation, is then allowed to foster into another, that somehow that bleeds into their own lives, so to speak. And I think I also liked the idea of coaching because you're also allowing other people to realize potential. And human potential is it's a very tricky thing because I am not of the ilk that I believe that you either have it or you don't. That's just, I don't believe that. I believe that we all are, and this is a tenet of the coaching programs that I'm certified in, is that we believe that people are whole and they are creative and they have all the answers. It's just been masked. It's been overwhelmed. It's been hidden. And our job is to unhide the things that are there. So it's the statues that Michelangelo, I think he mentioned that the work of art was always in there. He just chiseled away at what others couldn't see. He had the vision. He had the goal. But I think the chiseling part is really what excites me in the area of human potential, human condition. And also, I have to say it was healthcare because whether you believe in destiny or fate, this is what the cards were dealt for me. And I can't deny that I used healthcare and wellness to be here today speaking to you and to also do and act upon my own inner desire. And that's the truth. And the truth shall set you free.
Are you working on anything else? Do you have anything up and coming that you'd like to share?
So at the moment, I have a few more spots for 2026 for keynoting. That's really exciting to me. And I'll tell you why, Oakley, because yes, I do coaching and yes, and it's great to do individual work. But when you're on a stage, especially with healthcare leaders who make such pressing decisions, and I'm not going to deny, but the healthcare industry in the US does need work. But I also am of the feeling that people often say work in a corporate structure, it's so soul sucking this. And, why can't it be soul searching? Why can't we change the paradigm? And instead of saying it's soul sucking, it's be soul searching. Maybe the goal is for you to work within the confines of that and find ways and means to create happiness from it. So keynoting is important because I feel like from the top, if you was to look at a shower head, it trickles down. So for example, I'm talking to CEOs, I'm talking to CMOs, I'm talking to C-suite executives, and that information then gets disseminated to their team, to the organization, to the community, to their family, to their loved ones. I mean, it's just so rewarding. I am also at this point considering another book, but we'll see. I do have some media visits internationally as well that I'm excited about. I'm also, to a large degree, have always been entrepreneurial. So I'm looking at another venture that integrates AI, but not in, when it comes to AI, journalism is very tricky because is the work being fostered by you or machine? And so I actually would want to combine even my background. So I graduated a computer science and information systems degree. I mentioned to you that I was part of the .com. I worked for many, many startups back in the day. So I'm also even considering something like that. But at this point, I'm just trying to live and try to be an example of the truth that was given to me and the opportunity that's still given to me. Because as long as I can breathe, and I tell this to your audience as well, as long as you can breathe, there is hope, because hope never dies.
Wonderful. So with that, could you tell those listening where they can find your work and maybe your website, LinkedIn profile, all the above, so that they can feel free to reach out to you and foster new stories for themselves?
Thank you so much. So they can find me on my website, Savio P. Clemente. It's SAVIO P. Clemente.com. You can find my keynote work. Like I mentioned, I still have a few spots for 2026. They can also look at my TEDx talk, 7 Minutes to Wellness, How to Love Your Inner Stranger. You can find my book on there as well. I also, every Wednesday, write a Substack newsletter about the head, heart, and gut intelligence and what people can glean in order to gain their own clarity, composure. I talk about interviews. I'm running a new interview series with CMOs and CEOs of healthcare leadership. And then if they want to follow me on social media, I'm at every platform at The Human Resolve. And the reason why I named that is because, especially in the advent of AI, and I named that years and years ago, is the fact that the human element is always the one that will always surprise you. And always, the human element is always something that you should never underestimate. So they can find me at The Human Resolve.
Oh, thank you, Savio.
Thank you.
If this podcast challenged you, good. Clarity often does. The point here isn't consensus or reassurance. It's to leave you more precise than when you arrived. Keep what sharpens your thinking. Discard the rest. But don't confuse familiarity with truth. If this conversation mattered, follow the podcast and share it selectively with people who value depth and not noise. Until next time, stay disciplined with your thinking, selective with your attention, and honest about what you're really optimizing for.